There's a kind of crime that doesn't leave behind bloodstains or broken glass. No flashing lights, no crime scene tape, just silence, just fear, just lives quietly but completely destroyed. And for decades in America, that kind of crime wasn't just ignored. It was official policy. They called it national security. They called it moral protection. But underneath those words was something much darker, something designed to erase people like me. People like your neighbors, your friends, your teachers, your heroes. It was called the Lavender Scare, and if you've never heard of it, that's not by accident. This was a time when the US government systematically targeted LGBTQ plus people, not for breaking laws, not for betraying secrets, but simply for being who they were. Thousands were fired, outed, blacklisted, humiliated, and worst of all, forgotten. This isn't a story about one killer or one corrupt official. This is a story about what happens when an entire country decides that your identity is the crime. In today's episode of True Crime Echoes, we're going to uncover what really happened during the Lavender Scare, how it started, who it hurt, and why its impact is still echoing through lives today. Some stories make the headlines, others are buried. This one was buried deep, but not anymore. Chapter 1: The Fear That Lived in the Silence. I want you to imagine waking up one morning in 1950s America. You've got a steady government job. Maybe you're a librarian or a clerk at the State Department. You dress neatly, you pay your taxes, you keep your head down, you don't cause trouble. But you have one secret. A truth so dangerous that if anyone were to find out, you could lose everything. That truth, you're gay. And in 1950s, America, that was enough to end your entire life. Not in a figurative sense. I mean, really end it, your career, your friendships, your reputation, and in too many cases, your will to keep going. Because back then, being gay wasn't just misunderstood, it was criminalized, demonized, and most insidiously, politicized. This was the United States during the Cold War, when fear was a currency and suspicion was a tool. And in the hands of one ambitious, power-hungry senator, that tool became a weapon, one that would be used to target thousands of Americans in what would become one of the most shameful, least talked about chapters in our history. They called it the Lavender Scare. Now, if you've never heard of it, you're not alone. I hadn't either, not until I stumbled into a rabbit hole late one night reading about this period of American history that almost felt too surreal to be real. But it was real. Very real. And at the heart of it all was a man named Joseph McCarthy. You might have heard of him in the context of the Red Scare, the hunt for communists in America. That alone is disturbing enough. But here's what most people don't realize: while McCarthy was building his legacy by feeding the nation's paranoia, he quietly, and then not so quietly, turned his attention toward another group of so-called threats. Not Soviet spies, not foreign agents, gay men, lesbian women. Queer Americans who had done absolutely nothing wrong except exist in a country that refused to see them as human. I remember reading about one man who said, "We lived in terror almost every day of our lives, not because they were criminals, not because they were traitors, but because of who they loved, and because the government had made them its target. And here's what still haunts me. This wasn't some rogue policy tucked away in a single agency. This was coordinated, systemic. It was carried out by people who wore suits and shook hands and smiled for the camera. People who said they were protecting America. They weren't. They were destroying it from the inside by turning fear into law and silence into survival." What happened during the Lavender Scare isn't just a footnote in history. It's a mirror, a reminder of what happens when fear wins, when power is unchecked, when we let people get labeled as threats not for what they do, but for who they are. So today I want to take you with me back to that era. We're going to walk through the rise of Joseph McCarthy. We'll talk about the entrapments, the blacklists, the secret files, and the lives destroyed in the name of national security. But we're also going to talk about resistance, about quiet defiance, about the few who dared to speak out. Because in the middle of all that fear, there were still people who fought, and their stories matter. They deserve to be told in full. Let's begin. Chapter 2: The Man Who Fed the Fire. To really understand how the Lavender Scare happened, you have to understand the man who ignited it. Joseph McCarthy. Now, when I first started reading about him, I expected some kind of mastermind, a political genius with some complex strategy, but that's not what I found. McCarthy wasn't remarkable. In fact, for most of his career, he was kind of a nobody. A junior senator from Wisconsin, loud, crude, not particularly well-liked. He passed almost no meaningful legislation. He wasn't known for his intellect or vision or diplomacy. He was just another forgettable politician. Until he discovered the one thing that could change everything: fear. In 1950, at this random event in West Virginia, a women's club of all things, McCarthy decided to shake things up. He stepped onto the podium, probably still bitter he hadn't been invited to the big Republican fundraiser back in Washington. And instead of giving the safe, boring speech on housing for veterans, which was what he was supposed to talk about, he dropped a bombshell. He waved a piece of paper in the air and claimed that he had a list of 205 known communists working inside the U.S. State Department. Just like that, he had their attention. And he knew it. The thing is, he never actually showed anyone that list. There's no evidence it even existed. But it didn't matter. The press ran with it. The public panicked. And overnight, McCarthy went from background noise to front-page news. He didn't need to prove anything. He just had to say it loud enough and people would believe it. And here's where things get even darker. See, once McCarthy realized how powerful it was to accuse someone of being a communist without evidence, he doubled down. He didn't just go after spies or diplomats. He expanded the definition of threat. And before long, that included anyone who didn't quite fit in, especially gay men and women. Why? Because in McCarthy's mind, and in the minds of so many Americans at the time, homosexuality wasn't just immoral. It was dangerous, deviant, a security risk. They believed, or at least pretended to believe, that gay people were more likely to be blackmailed, that they couldn't be trusted with secrets, that if you were in the closet, you were a liability, and it gave McCarthy all the ammunition he needed. Suddenly, are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party turned into, are you gay? Two questions, same outcome. Once you were labeled, your life was over. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, how quickly a lie can become a weapon in the hands of the right person. Or I guess the wrong person. McCarthy was desperate to matter, and the Cold War paranoia gave him a stage. But what's worse is how many people stood behind him. How many journalists echoed his claims? How many voters applauded him for protecting America? People wrote letters praising him, thanking him for rooting out perversion. He became a hero to people who didn't even know what they were afraid of, they just needed someone to blame. And that's the thing about fear. It's contagious. It spreads faster than truth. McCarthy built his career on fear. And he did it by weaponizing identity. It wasn't about national security. It was about power. Plain and simple. What chills me is how easy it was for him to gain that power. All it took was one speech, one lie, and thousands of lives would never be the same again. Because once the fire was lit, the government didn't just sit back. They poured gasoline on it. Chapter 3. When a lie becomes policy. Fari. Once Joseph McCarthy lit the match, the flames spread faster than anyone expected. And what started as a reckless accusation in a forgotten ballroom quickly became something far more dangerous. It became policy. The idea that there were communists hiding in plain sight, it caught on. It terrified people. But the idea that gay people were communists, that somehow being queer made you a traitor, that became government logic. It's bizarre now looking back how easily the two identities got fused together, as if being gay and being disloyal to your country were somehow connected. But that was the twisted thinking that fueled what would later be called the Lavender Scare. And I'll be honest, when I first learned about that term, I thought it sounded almost harmless. Lavender. It sounds like a bath bomb or a candle scent. But no, it was lethal. Quietly, invisibly, and methodically, it destroyed lives. See, after McCarthy's claims started flooding the headlines, the U.S. government, especially the State Department, began conducting internal investigations. Not for espionage, not for treason, but for sexual orientation. They called it rooting out security risks. What they really meant was find the gay people, fire them, There were committees formed, secret files built. People followed home from work, questioned in dark rooms without lawyers, asked humiliating questions about their sex lives, their friends, even their childhoods. They were told to confess, or to name someone else. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. Because once someone accused you of being a homosexual, the only way to prove your loyalty was to give them someone else. And if you refused, that refusal was treated like a confession. It was a witch hunt in the truest sense. The logic was circular, the accusations were vague, and the punishment was always the same: public shame, private devastation, and permanent exile. Imagine what that must have felt like, knowing that one wrong word, one suspicious friendship, one curious glance could end your entire future. There's something especially cruel about being hunted, not for something you did, but for who you are. Something you can't explain, or hide forever, or fix, no matter how careful you are. And the government knew that. They counted on it. They used silence as a weapon. They made fear the default setting, and what made it all worse was how invisible it was. There were no public trials, no televised hearings, not at this stage. Just a quiet knock on your door, a transfer, a termination, a life erased without a headline. The State Department, the CIA, the FBI, all of them were in on it. Some sources estimate that thousands of federal employees were either fired or forced to resign because of their sexuality. Not because they were disloyal, not because they did anything wrong, just because they were labeled. And once you were labeled, you couldn't fight back. You couldn't appeal. You couldn't even talk about it, because if you did, you were just confirming what they already believed. I think that's what makes this part of the story so terrifying. It wasn't just fear of being gay, it was fear of being called gay, even if you weren't, even if no one really knew. The accusation alone was enough to ruin you. I came across a quote while researching this story from a man who was caught up in the Lavender Scare. He said, "You didn't have to be guilty of anything, you just had to be nervous." That stuck with me. Because in that climate, nervousness looked like guilt, silence looked like admission, and survival meant betraying someone else. People were pitted against their colleagues, their roommates, their friends. If you were interrogated, they'd ask you to list anyone you suspected, people you thought might be unfit. And if you didn't, that was all the proof they needed. So people lied about themselves, about each other. They erased parts of their lives. They broke up with people they loved. They quit their jobs. They vanished. Some even took their own lives rather than live under the crushing weight of that shame. All in the name of protecting national security. But let's be honest, it had nothing to do with security. It was never about loyalty. It was about control, conformity, and fear of the other. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 4. Confess or be destroyed. You know what's really scary? It wasn't just the firings, or the rumors, or the sudden disappearances. It was the way people were forced to participate in their own destruction. This wasn't just about catching so-called security risks. This was about manufacturing guilt, and then using it as a weapon to dig deeper. Once someone was accused of being gay, or even suspected, they were brought in for questioning. Sometimes in a government building, sometimes in a windowless office, sometimes just in their own home. And they weren't read their rights, they weren't offered lawyers, they were just sat down and told to talk. But it wasn't a conversation, it was an interrogation. Questions weren't about your job or your work performance. They were about your personal life, who you spent time with, who you lived with, what kind of books you read, whether or not you had ever been involved with someone of the same sex. Even if you denied it, which most people did terrified out of their minds, it didn't matter. They'd keep pushing, keep digging, keep pressing. And then came the moment that truly broke people. We need names. That's what they were really after. Names, lists, leads. Because the Lavender Scare wasn't just about getting rid of you. It was about using you to find the next person. And if you didn't give them someone, that refusal was seen as proof. They'd say things like, "Why would you protect someone unless you had something to hide?" And just like that, your silence became a confession. It was a trap. Every answer led to more suspicion. Every attempt to defend yourself just made you look more guilty. Even saying too little was incriminating. Even saying too much. And sometimes, and this part hurts, people broke. Not because they were bad, Not because they wanted to hurt anyone, but because they were exhausted, terrified, cornered. So they gave a name. Maybe it was a colleague, a roommate, a friend, maybe even someone they weren't sure about. But they gave that name because they thought it might buy them time, or mercy, or maybe even a chance to keep their job. But mercy never came. It was never enough. Because once the machine started turning, it needed more fuel, more fear, more names. It reminds me a lot of the Salem witch trials. People were pointing fingers to save themselves, but all it did was feed the fire. It created this endless cycle of suspicion and betrayal. And the government sat back and watched it happen because that's exactly what they wanted. They didn't want justice. They wanted compliance. They wanted obedience. And fear, that was the fastest way to get both. But even that wasn't the end of it. Once your name was in the file, once you were labeled a security risk, it followed you. Even if you weren't officially fired, even if you made it through the questioning, the whisper network would begin. People would stop talking to you. Opportunities would disappear. You'd become a liability socially and professionally. Some people were transferred to dead-end jobs. Others were pushed into early retirement. Many just disappeared from public life altogether, faded into obscurity, or worse. And no one talked about it. That's the part I can't shake. The silence, the shame, the way entire lives were unraveled quietly behind closed doors without headlines or outrage. Just a name, in a file, a pink slip, a door closed forever. It's easy to look back now and wonder why people didn't fight harder, why they didn't resist. But how do you fight something that doesn't play by the rules? How do you protest when speaking out confirms exactly what they've accused you of? You couldn't win. You could only survive. And survival meant shrinking, hiding, lying. It meant watching your back, filtering your words, denying who you were, every day. For some, it meant losing faith, not just in the system, but in themselves. And for others, it meant something even darker. There were people who couldn't take it, the loss, the isolation, the unbearable weight of shame placed on them by a country they had devoted their lives to serving. Some of them didn't make it. They deserved to be remembered too. Because this wasn't just a policy. It wasn't just politics. It was personal. It was violent. And it was deadly. And it wasn't over yet. Chapter 5. The Fall of a Bully. It turns out, fear only gets you so far. For a while, Joseph McCarthy was untouchable. He had the press in his pocket. He had the public eating out of the palm of his hand. He spoke with confidence, with fire, with this false sense of righteousness that made people believe he was the only thing standing between them and national collapse. But when you build your entire reputation on accusations and fear, there's only one way that story ends. Eventually, people start asking for proof. And McCarthy, he didn't have any. For years, he threw out numbers, waved papers, made declarations about communists and homosexuals infiltrating every level of government, but never once produced anything real. And somehow, no one called him on it. Not at first. But all it takes is one misstep, one overreach, and that's exactly what brought him down. In 1954, McCarthy did the unthinkable. He went after the United States Army. Let that sink in for a second. At a time when patriotism was everything, when military service was sacred, McCarthy accused the Army of being soft on communism. He claimed they were harboring traitors, that their most secure facilities were compromised by bad security, poor leadership, and, of course, gay employees. This time he'd pushed too far. Because the Army didn't just sit back and take it, they had their own cards to play. And they were tired of being used as a prop in McCarthy's circus. What followed was a series of events that I can only describe as the unraveling of a tyrant. The Senate launched hearings to investigate McCarthy's claims. These weren't closed-door meetings or internal memos. These were televised hearings, the first of their kind in American history. Suddenly, the man who had operated in shadows, who had built his empire on whispers and secrets, was under the spotlight, and America watched. What they saw wasn't a brave protector of democracy. They saw a bitter, petty man lashing out, interrupting witnesses, attacking his opponents, grasping for control. There's one moment that's become almost legendary. During a particularly heated exchange, McCarthy accused the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, of harboring a communist in his law firm. It was one accusation too many. Welch stared him down and said, and I'll never forget this quote, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" That line didn't just cut McCarthy down, it shattered him. In that moment, everything shifted. The room fell silent. The press stopped cheering. The public, watching from living rooms across the country, finally saw the cruelty behind the performance. The spell was broken, and McCarthy, for the first time in his career, was on the defensive. It's wild to think that this man who had caused so much damage, who had made so many people live in fear for simply existing, could be undone by a single sentence. But sometimes that's all it takes. Just one person saying enough. After the hearings, McCarthy's power evaporated almost overnight. He was censured by the Senate, removed from all major committees. He kept his title, but not his influence. The man who had once controlled the headlines became a national embarrassment. His allies distanced themselves. His phone stopped ringing. And just a few years later, in 1957, Joseph McCarthy died of hepatitis alone, disgraced and largely forgotten by the very people who had once worshipped him. But the damage he did, that didn't die with him. The systems he helped create, the blacklists, the surveillance, the climate of suspicion, they outlived him. They continued to haunt the LGBTQ+ community for decades. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all is this. While McCarthy was publicly attacking gay people, he was surrounded by men who were themselves rumored to be closeted, including his right-hand man, Roy Cohn. Cohn was young, brilliant, vicious, and deeply ambitious. He played McCarthy's game to perfection. He helped lead the investigations. He destroyed careers. And all the while, he too lived with a secret. Years later, it would be revealed that Roy Cohn was gay. He died of complications from AIDS in 1986, still denying his sexuality to the very end, still insisting he was the exception to the rules he helped write. There's something tragically poetic about that. Because the Lavender Scare wasn't just a government campaign, it was a mirror held up to a country that feared what it didn't understand and punished those who dared to be different. McCarthy may have fallen, but the machinery he built, it was still turning. And for the people caught in its gears, the worst was far from over. Chapter 6. The Witch Hunt Without a Witch. You'd think that once McCarthy fell, the madness would stop. You'd think that after the public saw him unravel on live television, after the Senate publicly condemned him, that maybe the fear would ease up. Maybe the country would take a breath, reflect, and realize just how many innocent people had been destroyed by nothing more than suspicion and stigma. But no. The Lavender Scare didn't end with McCarthy. In some ways, it only became more organized. Because when a mob loses its leader, it doesn't just go home. It looks for a new one. And in this case, the U.S. government filled that vacuum with something more structured, more clinical, and arguably even more dangerous, the Hoyt Commission. The name comes from Senator Clyde Hoey, spelled Hoey, but pronounced Hoy. He was a Southern Democrat with that same old-school blend of charm and cruelty. And in 1950, just as McCarthy was gaining steam, Hoey was quietly launching his own investigation into sex perversion in government. That was their term for it, sex perversion. It sounds archaic now, but back then, it was language that carried legal weight. It was their excuse, their justification. And the Hoey Commission, it was about to make sure that excuse stuck. They started compiling reports, interviewing government workers, judges, military officials, and even psychologists. The goal was simple: to prove that gay people were inherently unfit to serve, that their mere presence was a threat to national security. And the thing is, they didn't just rely on rumor or innuendo. They wanted to make it official. They wanted it in writing. I remember reading parts of the report and just sitting there stunned. Like this wasn't a fringe theory passed around at a dinner table. This was federal policy, on paper, paid for by tax dollars, sanctioned by the Senate. The report claimed that thousands of homosexuals were currently employed by the federal government. They even gave a number, 700. It was a shocking figure, one that wasn't verified, of course, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Because now, this wasn't about individuals, it was about a category, a class, a target. And they weren't vague about it. The report literally said that one homosexual can pollute an entire government office. Pollute. That was the language they used. This wasn't about rooting out spies anymore. This was about cleaning house, about creating a sanitized version of America that fit one narrow mold: white, straight, conservative, married, preferably male. Anyone who didn't fit that mold was a threat, not because of what they did, but because of who they were. And what makes it even more heartbreaking is how this policy forced people into impossible corners. Because once you're labeled a threat, what can you do? You can't appeal. You can't explain, you can't beg. The minute the accusation hits, it becomes your identity, and no amount of service, no number of clean performance reviews, no letters of support will save you. Your job gone, your reputation gone, and often your future also gone. That's what the Hoyt Commission did. It normalized the purge, it gave it a manual, a rationale, a process, and suddenly this wasn't just McCarthy shouting into a microphone, it was the system itself, cold, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. And what's even more disturbing, this went on for decades. Quietly, silently. Without the headlines, without the drama, but with just as much devastation. Because once a government decides that part of your identity makes you dangerous, it doesn't need a villain to carry that out. It just needs a filing cabinet. Chapter 7. The Man They Erased. If there's one thing that's haunted me while researching the Lavender Scare, it's how easy it was to erase a life. How a man could be trusted with national secrets one day, and then treated like a threat the next, all because of who he was. And no story makes that clearer than the story of Carmel Offee. Now, Carmel wasn't a household name. You won't find him in most history books. But he was one of the most trusted men in Washington at one point, a high-level State Department official with years of experience and loyalty to the U.S. government. He worked with ambassadors, intelligence leaders, even presidents. But none of that saved him. Carmel was born in Pennsylvania in 1909. He was sharp fluent in multiple languages and deeply committed to public service. He climbed the ranks quickly, eventually working closely with William C. Bullitt, one of the most powerful U.S. ambassadors at the time. He followed Bullitt everywhere from Moscow to Paris and became his most trusted aide. Their relationship wasn't just professional, it was loyal, even personal. Offee managed Bullitt's travel, his meetings, his medications. He was indispensable. People in D.C. knew his name. He was good at what he did, dependable, quiet, efficient. He kept his head down and did his job, the kind of civil servant every government wishes it had more of. But there was one thing they didn't like about him. He was gay, and even though he never flaunted it and never did anything remotely illegal or improper in his work, people whispered. They made jokes. They gave him nicknames behind his back. K.Y. Offee, some called him mocking both his name and their assumptions about his personal life, and those whispers, they were all it took. In 1943, Offee was arrested in Lafayette Park, a known cruising area near the White House. He had approached another man, someone who turned out to be an undercover police officer. The officer pretended to be interested, and then handcuffed him on the spot. It was a textbook entrapment, and it worked. Offee's boss tried to keep it quiet. They came up with a cover story that he had been there on official business meeting a contact. It helped reduce the charges. He wasn't jailed. There was no public scandal, but there was a file now, a label, a stain, and it never went away. Even though Offee managed to find work again in the government, even though he continued to serve with distinction, the rumors followed him. Every new position came with fresh scrutiny. Every promotion was met with suspicion. Then one day it all caught up with him. In 1950, he was quietly told that he was being let go, not because of poor performance, not because of misconduct, but because someone somewhere had decided he was a security risk. And that was it. No hearing, no trial, no chance to defend himself. Just a notice, a goodbye, and a door closed forever. Offee tried to fight it. He argued that being open about his identity actually made him less of a blackmail risk, not more. He made the case that he had never betrayed his country, never failed in his duties, never given anyone a reason to doubt his loyalty. But none of that mattered. He was forced to resign. And from that moment on, he became the face of the government's internal purge, whether he wanted to or not. Senators referenced him in hearings. Journalists whispered his name. He was Exhibit A in the case for removing perverts from public service. And yet, he had done nothing wrong, nothing but exist. And exist honestly. That's the part that sticks with me the most. Carmel Offie was honest. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't leading a double life. He just wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. And in the eyes of the government, that made him dangerous. There's this heartbreaking irony in his story. The very thing they claimed made him a threat, the potential for blackmail, was eliminated by his transparency. But instead of seeing that as strength, they saw it as weakness. They chose fear over fact, policy over person, silence over truth, and Offie paid the price. His career ended in disgrace. His name, once respected, was reduced to a warning, a cautionary tale, a punchline for people in power who didn't understand him and didn't want to try. And I think about how many others were just like him. How many Carmel Offies we never heard about because their stories didn't survive. Their files were shredded, their careers erased, their names forgotten. But not this one. We remember Carmel Offie because we need to, because history has a way of repeating itself when we forget the cost of silence and the courage it takes to live in truth. Chapter 8. The Man Who Said No. For a long time, people just disappeared. They lost their jobs, they moved away, they kept quiet, and who could blame them? The cost of speaking up was just too high. But then, something changed. One man said no, and that man was Dale Jennings. I still remember the first time I read about him. It was late at night, and I was digging through articles trying to understand how anyone could fight back in an era so soaked in fear. And there he was, not just resisting, but doing it publicly, loudly, and without apology. It felt revolutionary. Dale was a writer, a World War II veteran, and one of the founding members of the Mattachine Society, one of the earliest gay rights organizations in the United States. But before he was any of those things, he was just a guy trying to live quietly in Los Angeles. And then in 1952, he was arrested. It happened like so many of these stories did. An undercover vice cop approached him in a park, tried to initiate a conversation, and when Jennings didn't take the bait, the officer arrested him anyway, charged him with lewd behavior, tried to ruin his life. But Jennings didn't fold. He didn't take a plea deal. He didn't disappear. He fought back. And in doing so, he did something almost unheard of at the time. He stood up in court and said, "Yes, I am gay, but I am not guilty of this crime." He admitted who he was publicly in front of a judge and jury, and then demanded justice. Can you imagine the courage that took in 1952 being openly gay was enough to get you fired, ostracized, or institutionalized? But Jennings chose to risk everything because he was tired of hiding, tired of the fear, tired of watching lives destroyed for no reason at all. And that choice changed everything. The trial was brutal. The prosecution tried to paint him as deviant, dangerous, unstable. But Jennings stayed calm, clear, unapologetic. He never denied his identity, only the false charges against him, and the jury. They couldn't reach a verdict. The judge was forced to dismiss the case. Now, in most situations, a mistrial isn't exactly a victory, but this time, it was seismic. Because Jennings's defiance proved something that no policy or scare campaign ever could, they couldn't silence everyone. And maybe, just maybe, people were ready to fight back. The Mattachine Society, which had started as a small secretive discussion group in someone's living room, suddenly had momentum. Jennings' case drew attention, support, and most importantly, hope. For the first time, gay Americans had a name, an organization, a banner to rally behind. The Mattachine wasn't perfect. There were internal divisions, ideological clashes, debates about how public they should be. Some members wanted to blend in to argue that gay people were just like everyone else. Others wanted to challenge the system outright, to reject the idea that they needed to be anything other than themselves. But no matter the strategy, one thing was clear: the silence was breaking. Jennings's case marked a shift from quiet survival to quiet resistance. And that resistance would grow. It would spread. Slowly, painfully, imperfectly. But it would spread. There's something beautiful about that, I think. The Lavender Scare wasn't just about terror. It wasn't just about McCarthy or Hoover or the Hoyt Commission. It was about the everyday people they tried to erase and the fact that those people refused to stay erased. Dale Jennings didn't change the world overnight, but he cracked the door open, and for the first time in a long time, people on the other side could see the light. Chapter 9. Quiet Sparks in the Dark. Something changed after Dale Jennings stood his ground. It was subtle at first. The government still whispered. People still lost their jobs. The Lavender Scare didn't just vanish overnight, but for the first time, there was a crack in the wall. And through that crack, something powerful started to grow. Community. You see, up until that point, being gay in America meant being isolated. You weren't just closeted, you were alone. There were no public spaces, no support networks, no language to describe what you were feeling or who you were. It was like living in a world where your reflection didn't exist. But after the Mattachine Society stepped into the light, even just a little, that began to change. More people found each other. Quietly, cautiously, and often in secret. But still, they found each other. And when people find each other, they begin to build. What started as whispered conversations in living rooms soon became organized meetings. Book clubs, potlucks, letters passed back and forth across the country. People began asking bold questions like, why are we illegal? Why are we immoral? Who decided we were a threat? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what would happen if we stopped hiding? It wasn't loud. Not yet. But it was happening. There were these newsletters typed by hand and mailed in plain envelopes, newsletters that gave advice, shared poetry, sometimes just offered comfort. One of them was called One Magazine, and I remember reading an issue from the late 1950s where the editor simply said, "You are not alone. We are here." That line hit me like a train. Imagine living your entire life believing you were the only one. And then, one day a piece of paper arrives in your mailbox that says, otherwise. That's not just news. That's oxygen. And of course, the government tried to stop it. They labeled those magazines obscene. They arrested people for distributing them. They tried to shut down the mailings. But it didn't work. Because by now, the fear was starting to wear thin. The world was shifting. Slowly, yes, painfully slowly, but shifting nonetheless. The civil rights movement was taking shape. People were marching, demanding to be seen, to be heard, to be human. And even though the gay rights movement wasn't yet marching in the streets, it was drawing strength from that same fire. The idea that maybe, just maybe, America's promise was supposed to include everyone. But the government. It hadn't learned its lesson. FBI files on suspected homosexuals kept growing. Military discharges continued. Federal agencies still enforced moral fitness standards, code for exclusion. And the message was clear: if you were queer, you were not welcome. Still, people didn't go away. They adapted. They organized smarter, quieter, more deliberately. Groups like the Daughters of Bilitis, the first lesbian civil rights organization in the U.S., started hosting discussion groups in San Francisco. In New York, underground bars and clubs became not just places to dance, but places to breathe. Places where for a few stolen hours no one had to lie. That duality of fear and resistance defined the era. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underground. The roots were growing deeper. Sometimes I think about those early meetings, the chairs pulled close in someone's basement, the coffee brewed quietly in the corner, the hush that fell over the room when a new face walked in, everyone wondering, is this person one of us, or someone sent to destroy us? And yet, they still showed up. Week after week, letter after letter, magazine after magazine. Not because they expected change to happen tomorrow, but because they knew it couldn't wait forever. That's the part people forget when they talk about the 1950s and early 60s. It wasn't all repression. It was also the birth of something radical, not in protests or riots, but in community, in survival, in saying, we will not be erased. Those quiet sparks in the dark, they were setting the stage for something much bigger. And the world, it wasn't ready, but the people were. Chapter 10, From Shadows to Fire. Looking back, I think the most dangerous thing about the Lavender Scare wasn't just the firings, or the surveillance, or the humiliation. It was how effective it was at making people believe they were alone. That silence, that shame, it settled over everything like fog. People learned to edit themselves in every conversation, every interaction, even in their own homes. The fear became muscle memory. But what no one counted on was that even in the shadows, people were watching, people were listening. And most importantly, people were waiting for a moment to push back, to stop apologizing, to stop hiding. That moment came in the summer of 1969. But before we get to Stonewall, I think it's important to say that it didn't happen out of nowhere. By the late 60s, America was a boiling pot. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Anti-war protests filled the streets, feminist voices were growing louder, and through it all, gay people were still being beaten, arrested, mocked, and fired just for existing. There was this tension building, a pressure like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. You could feel it in the air, in the back rooms of gay bars, in the whispers between friends, in the frustration of knowing that no matter how quietly or respectfully you lived, you were still considered a criminal, a pervert, a threat. And then came June 28th, 1969. It was just past midnight when police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City's Greenwich Village. And let's be clear, this wasn't unusual. Raids were common. Cops would storm in beat, people demand IDs, arrest anyone who didn't conform. What was different was what happened next. This time the people inside fought back. No more apologizing, no more running. They threw coins, then bottles, then bricks. They screamed, they stood their ground. And suddenly what had started as another humiliating police raid turned into a full-blown uprising. The riot lasted for days. The streets around the Stonewall Inn became a war zone of anger and energy and defiance. And while no one knew it at the time, history was shifting beneath their feet. Because this was the spark. This was the moment the movement stopped asking and started demanding. I think about how many people involved in those riots had lived through the Lavender Scare, how many of them had been fired or outed or beaten down by the weight of silence. And here they were standing in the street saying enough. That's what makes Stonewall so powerful. It wasn't just about that night. It was about everything that came before. All the fear, all the silence, all the lives ruined by a government that called them dangerous, all the courtrooms where people had no defense, all the park benches where arrests were made, all the jobs lost, all the families torn apart. And suddenly, that quiet suffering exploded into resistance. A year later, the first Pride March was held to commemorate the riots. Thousands of people marched through New York holding signs that said, "Gay is good," and "We are your children." They didn't ask for permission. They didn't hide their faces. They walked in broad daylight for themselves and for everyone who couldn't. That was the turning point. From then on, the movement grew louder, faster, bolder. Laws were challenged, organizations formed, allies stepped in, and the government, the same one that once hunted these people, was now being forced to reckon with their existence. And I think about how much of that change traces back to the people who came before the ones who never made headlines. The ones like Carmel Offee, who lost everything, or Dale Jennings, who stood up in court, or the unnamed woman who got a newsletter in the mail and realized she wasn't alone. This story, the story of the Lavender Scare, doesn't end with Stonewall, but it transforms there. It becomes something bigger, something filled with fire and color and heartbreak and hope. And maybe that's the most powerful thing of all, that a campaign designed to erase people ended up igniting a movement that could never be erased again. Chapter 11. Echoes We Still Hear. Even now, all these years later, the Lavender Scare still lingers. Not in the way it used to, not in the raids or the interrogations, not in the purges or the whisper campaigns, but in the quieter places. In the things we don't say, in the stories we still don't tell, in the silences that never really went away. That's what haunts me the most. Because the truth is, we don't really know how many lives were destroyed. We have numbers estimates. Historians suggest thousands were fired, maybe tens of thousands investigated. But what we don't have is names, faces, full stories. So many people erased before they were ever remembered. And for the ones who did survive, the ones who rebuilt, who kept their heads down, who moved on, the scars didn't fade. They just got buried. I've read letters from men who were interrogated for hours, asked about things they had never spoken aloud to another human being. Some were threatened with exposure, told to confess or be ruined. Others were turned in by friends, by neighbors, even by family. Can you imagine that kind of betrayal? One letter stayed with me. A man, a former government translator, described how after his firing, he couldn't find work for over a year. Every time he applied for a job, there was a red mark on his record. No explanation, no appeal, just disqualified. He said it felt like my entire identity had been weaponized against me. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped looking people in the eye. I stopped believing I was worth anything. That wasn't an isolated story. That was the point of the Lavender Scare. It wasn't just about removing people from jobs. It was about shame, about sending a message so loud and so clear that people would internalize it even when no one was watching. And it worked. For decades, generations of LGBTQ plus Americans grew up with that message burned into their lives: hide who you are, or pay the price. Even today, I still meet older folks who whisper when they talk about their identity, people who flinch when they see uniforms, people who still hesitate to hold hands in public. And these aren't just habits, they're survival instincts, ones learned in the shadow of state-sponsored fear. But here's the other side of it, and it's just as real: they're still here. The ones who were supposed to disappear, they're still here. They raised families, they built careers, they protested, they marched, they created art and community and memory. They refused to be broken by a system that tried to crush them, and their stories matter, because the Lavender Scare didn't just shape policy, it shaped people. It made it harder to love openly, to trust, to dream without fear. But it also made people resilient, defiant, fierce. It forced an entire generation to learn how to protect themselves and eventually how to fight back. And I think about that a lot, especially now in a world where LGBTQ plus rights are still being debated, where books are being banned, where drag queens are being criminalized, where trans people are being targeted, where the same tired arguments about morality and national security are still being dragged out like ghosts from another era. It reminds me that these stories aren't just history, they're warnings. The Lavender Scare didn't start with mass arrests. It started with words, with rumors, with moral fitness tests and whispered threats. It started quietly, incrementally, until one day it was everywhere and no one felt safe. And if we forget that, we risk repeating it. So when I tell these stories, I do it not just to honor the people who lived them, but to remind us that silence is never neutral, that shame can be deadly, and that dignity should never come with conditions. We have a responsibility now, all of us, to listen, to remember, and to carry forward what they couldn't always say out loud: that we were never the threat. We were never the danger. We were simply living, and that should have been enough. The Lavender Scare may not be taught in every school. It may not show up in every textbook. But the damage it caused? It's still with us. It lives in the hesitations people still carry, in the careers that never had a chance to begin, in the families torn apart by fear, and in the silences that still echo through generations. But it also lives in resilience, in defiance, in people who refuse to disappear even when the government tried to make them invisible. As we close this chapter, I want to leave you with this. Real justice isn't just about punishing crimes. It's about telling the truth, especially the truths we were never supposed to know. The ones that were hidden, the ones that were scrubbed from records and locked behind redacted files. We tell these stories not to dwell in the past, but to protect the future. Because the warning signs, the language of fear, the labeling of people as threats, the push to silence those who are different, they're still out there. And they still carry weight. The Lavender Scare didn't end with an apology. It ended with survivors. And today, by remembering them, by saying their names, by telling their stories, we make sure they were never invisible at all. Thank you for joining me. This has been True Crime Echoes, and we'll see you next time.